Hey guys, it's Mathel here, and today I've got a video guide on the Cast on Crit PowerPoint presentation build. The way this build works is you stack a lot of crit, get a lot of spells, and when you crit, you create PowerPoint presentations. Right here I am doing a level 81 minus max temp chains beyond map, and it creates a stunning PowerPoint in which I kinda don't do too well in the end on, but it was fun while it lasted. Here's another box. Sometimes you don't quite create as many PowerPoints or as strong as you'd like. You just kind of play the game and it turns into a more of a movie than less of a slideshow. It really depends on how many things you attack and how great your gear is. Speaking of gear though, let's check out the gear and setup we're using to run this fantastic build. First of all, we got ourselves a 6-link CPU. Now that is an Intel i5 3570K, and it's been doing marvelous work for me for the past few years. Bear in mind, the more you spend on all of your gear, the worse your PowerPoint will be, as it'll be smoother and not quite as much as a PowerPoint. Up next, we dual wield two 4GB sticks of RAM or memory, and they're a very shiny red. Next is a mirrored Radeon 7900, which cost, I don't know, a fair bit a few years ago. And then the beast powering the setup is a crit capped Corsair 650 watt power supply. And lastly, somewhere in there is a 250 gig SSD, if you can find it. Take my word for it, it's there. It's pretty crucial for PoE. But I suppose we should take a look at some of the in-game gear as well. So as far as the in-game gear side of things go, which is kind of important I suppose, ideally you want to try and get a 6-link of some kind for the build. Now, I use the tabular up until about level 90, and that is perfectly fine. You just won't have such high evasion or defensive stats that you can and probably should try and get from a chest. You can go a more offensive chest, but I'm happy with an evasion chest with some life and filling out some resist, so it's more comfortable to build the build itself. Another alternative is Vol's Protector, and it's a crucial one if you want to go into a cold snap variant with the build, which I didn't really deem necessary. I'd rather go for defenses and not use cold snap. Just a regular old helm with some accuracy, some life and resist, bit of evasion if you can afford it. Nothing too special needed here, but some other options can be used. Some mid-series step boots. I've only started using these recently as I put in phase acro. Managed to roll +1 frenzy charge, that is pretty nice. So in total I have 46% spell dodge, and that's largely the way you take care of reflect on top of resist flasks. Got a pair of gloves with life, attack speed, 2 resists. These will probably be the place you house your Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ice Curse on hit setup to maintain power charges. That is because you need at least 3 blues, and it's probably the easiest slot to get those blues on, to just buy some gloves with ES and forget evasion in this one slot. Belt, not really too important, just get some life and some resists onto it. Then we have our 2 Elrond rings. Now to run this build you need pretty much 15, I think it is, minus mana cost to sustain your Spectral Throw, Cast on Crit and GMP. With this setup, 2 Elrond rings, you have a completely free Spectral Throw, and that means you can reserve as much mana as you want, as well as just not having to worry about mana regen, blood magic, anything else. I find this is the strongest setup you can get because the rings aren't really too crucial for a Cast on Crit setup anyway. Ideally, get a diamond ring, something similar to this, with some life, some accuracy, some resist. It's pretty hard to get something like that though, so my other one's kind of a piece of shit. Doesn't really matter too much. From a neck, you're going to want some life, some crit multi, some crit, and some accuracy if you can get it. Probably won't be able to get all of those stats. I have medium amounts in all of them. Life's fairly important, and as well as that, int is rather important to get on something. If not your neck, then a ring, because you need it to be able to fill out your Herald of Thunder. And your spells, of course. And lastly, I've chosen to dual wield for the build. Now, a lot of people when building custom crit Spectral Throw characters have come across some pretty heavy single target issues. I've managed to kind of negate those by dual wielding. So I have two very similar daggers because you alternate casting with your daggers or throwing with your daggers. So I have two very similar daggers. They pretty much do the same thing, and they have very high spell power. Ideally, you'd also like to get some crit multi on the dagger if possible, and I've chosen not to use Vegan daggers because I have high enough hit, which comes from the passive tree and gear, and isn't very hard to get, and that allows me to use daggers with really good crit, attack speed, and spell power, which is much harder to get on Vegan daggers. So, crit most importantly, attack speed probably second, and then high spell power if you can get it. These daggers were about 20 chaos each. You just got to find them from the right person at the right price. People don't value them too highly these days because most people go for Vegan daggers. Now, thanks to these two, as well as that, because of dual wielding, I have an extra 40% crit from the dagger, and I get twin terrors as well. So I'm pretty much crit capped on this character at all times if I have power charges up. And power charges come from the Curse on Hit Assassin Mark and Herald of Thunder setup, so you almost always have them. But I also fill out power charges with Frenzy and power charge on crit, so I run around and slap things with my Frenzy whenever I need to maintain power charges and Frenzy charges, especially on single target and things like Atsiri. Frenzy charges are a pretty important part of the build, as we end up getting 7 or however many you can get with boots, neck, etc. They are fairly important because it's one of the largest parts of your attack speed you scale, as well as damage. You don't get too much actual elemental or spell damage from the passive tree, so the frenzy charges scale your damage quite handily, as well as some other things like projectile damage, but it's mostly crit multi, and some jewels. For the passive tree itself, you do get some elemental damage from Shadow. If you start a Shadow, you don't necessarily have to. Can be a Ranger, can be a Duelist, doesn't really matter too much. And you grab a few jewel sockets. I'm not sure I have any left on him right now. That's actually the kind of jewel I'm using in all the sockets. Some life, some crit on one hand, and some resists, or whatever else you can get on those jewels. These jewels are pretty cheap because there's only 2 valuable mods on there. It costs me about 5 to 10 chaos per jewel to get things like this. Build from the actual crit side of things, you get an absolutely insane amount of crit going from daggers. Get all of that crit, all of this crit. You do not take out his touch because that only affects the daggers themselves for crit multi and not the spells, which is the largest source of your damage. Grab acro and phase acro to help survive. And the rest is pretty straightforward. You do end up getting 1% if you want another 1% there, and 1.6% there for regen to sustain your blood rage. I mostly sustain my blood rage through life flasks, as well as the regen itself, but it's not too important. It's just more a quality of life issue. Flasks keep you alive otherwise, because I don't have any life leech. And for the spells themselves, what do we got? I have chosen to use, for the most part, almost always, Arc. That's my #1 priority. Arctic Breath, #2 priority. And then your third one is kind of flexible, for me anyway. Usually I'm using Fireball or Ice Spear. Where the hell is Ice Spear? There he is. Now it really depends on what map I'm doing and which spell I'll choose to use. If there's fire resistance, I'll use Ice Spear. If there's, certain mobs that I would like more frozen, I'll still use Ice Spear. The damage is fairly similar. You can see that Fireball has a higher damage range, Ice Spear has a higher crit chance, and will crit more often if you're at range. So in the end, I think they have roughly similar amounts of damage. Fireball will probably do a bit more over the long term for most maps. But honestly, you can pick any one of like 10 spells and use them all to great success. It's entirely up to you. There's things like Magma Orb, which kind of sucks. Firestorm does a lot of damage, does a lot of lag. EK, you can't really use EK or Glacial Cascade too effectively with the Spectral Throw setup, because they just aren't reaching far enough. Usually you want to be hitting with the apex of your spectral throw, and neither of these will be hitting that far away, usually. Shock Nova's great, but you wouldn't really be using it with spectral throw. It's more when you play around with things like Cyclone. All in all, this has been one of the funnest builds I've played in 2.0 so far, and most effective. I'm level 92, I managed to hit about 4700 to 5k life, depending on what I put in. With my jewels, I'm up to about 5k life. I'm crit capped most of the time with the right setup on. Resist capped, not too big a deal, once I have my jewels in once again. And I have pretty good evasion and dodge and spell dodge. As well as that, I'm running Arctic Armor, which gives another 12% or so fizz reduction. But you can run Grace if you really want. I have Grace over here. I've chosen mostly to run Arctic Armor, Herald of Ice, and Herald of Thunder, and just leave some mana unreserved to cast things like Golem. And if you really want, you know, you can afford to drop an Elrond Ring maybe, grab a Mana Flask, things like that. Because putting on Grace gives you another 10% evasion at the loss of Arctic Armor, which is 10% damage reduction. It's really kind of up to you what you'd rather use in that situation. And I will probably use Grace in the long run, or it could really afford you to drop something like your chest, run Grace instead, and run a different chest. It's kind of up to you guys. I'm pretty flexible on the build. It's not too crucial exactly what you do. In any case, this has been Cast on Crit PowerPoint, but more specifically Cast on Crit Spectral Throw. It's been a very fun build for me, and I hope you guys give it a shot and have some great success with it as well. I'll see you guys next time.